So maybe it was something that Jesus was born with. An inherited gift like the ability to rap or to roll your tongue. Or maybe it was part of his divine nature. An innate ability that was part of Jesus' God self. Or maybe it was just something that Jesus learned to do as a young man. When he worked with his father, they would go to places like Sepphoris to do contracting work, build furniture for the merchants and upper-class families. But wherever it came from, Jesus had the ability to look at faces and instantly know. Look at faces and instantly know what that person was feeling, what they were going through. Instantly connect. And when they dragged that woman into the court of the temple where he was teaching and unceremoniously dumped her at his feet, they being some Pharisees and the leaders of the temple and some other men who had become part of the mob just because that's what people like to do. When the woman was cowering at his feet, Jesus looked into her eyes and he knew that she was terrified. She was gripped by a fear that went deep into her bones because she knew what was about to happen. She was terrified at the prospect of justice. She was frightened out of her mind by the idea that in the next few minutes, whatever miserable minutes remained in her life, she was going to get pushed into a corner, thrown down into a gully, and then she was going to be stoned by this mob that dragged her here. She would be battered. She would be pelted by rocks that would break her bones and bruise her flesh, until finally, a stone that was big enough, or hard enough, or thrown fast enough would crack her skull, dispatch her to the sweet relief of death. And that was all she had to look forward to. Jesus could look at her, and he could feel it. The tingling of his skin, the knot in his stomach. Feel what was going on in her. And he could also feel the growing anger of the mob. In 3 decades of life, he had seen it happen more than once. So it was no surprise when the Pharisee stood in front of Jesus and pointed to the woman and said, "Jesus, this woman right here was caught in the very act of adultery. The law of Moses demands that she be put to death for her crime." What do you say, Jesus? And as he sat there, Jesus knew this was a trap. Because if he said that this woman, of course, must die, then all of his preaching about grace and mercy would be shown to be just so much talk. So much feel-good stuff. And if he said she should not die, then he would be accused of flaunting the laws of Moses and trying to set himself above the law, trying to set himself above what God had ordained himself. So it was a trap for sure. And it was a carefully crafted one. And if you're the cynical kind, you might even wonder if the crime itself was a setup, since the man, the partner in crime, was not there to face justice as well. It's just the woman. But regardless of whether it was a setup or whether it was just a happy accident for his enemies, this problem now crouched before Jesus and licked its lips in anticipation of his failure. Because his enemies knew, they knew that there was no answer Jesus could give that would let him get away from this unscathed. Well, they didn't think there was. It's okay. What you might not know is that in Jesus' time, teachers didn't stand in front of a class or a group when they lectured. They sat. That was the place of honor. And after they had asked the question of him, what do we do, Jesus? He thought about it for a minute, and then he leaned over and he started to write in the dirt. And this made the people a little bit crazy. Because he had been asked a question, and his answer was just to sit here and draw. And this went on for some time. He ignored him. What was he writing? It's one of those great questions that you get from the Bible. What was he writing anyway? I like to think he was making a list. Bread, nacho chips, lamb. Don't forget the ice cream. Others say that he was writing passages from the laws of Moses. And other people, more fancifully, guess that he was maybe writing down the sins of each of the people who was present there. But what I read when I was preparing this message seemed like the most convincing answer to me, and that is that Jesus was just writing. It didn't really matter what he was writing, he was writing. And writing showed that he could read and write, and that elevated him at least to the level of a scribe. It was Jesus letting these guys know that they weren't dealing with some Galilean bumpkin fresh off the fishing boat. Instead, it was someone to be reckoned with. And if they didn't get it from the fact that he was writing, they understood it in the next minute. Because when this had gone on for a little bit, the leaders of the mob demanded an answer. Enough of this nonsense, Jesus. We asked you a question. What should happen to this woman? And then Jesus sat up and he spoke. And he shattered their beautifully constructed trap. Maybe their hopes and dreams besides. Now, this passage from John is a much beloved, often depicted story. So his answer isn't going to shock you. We heard it. But before I tell you what the answer was, again, I want to put it in context so that we can better understand what happened. Other than Jesus taking 1,000 years of teaching and suddenly saying, okay, let's look at it this way now. And I'll show you where you went wrong. So what you may not have known is that according to the laws laid down in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, a capital crime required at least 2 or 3 witnesses. So for adultery, at least 2 or 3 people needed to needed to testify to having caught them in the act. Without that, you couldn't have a death sentence. Deuteronomy also stated that by law, it was the witnesses whose hands must first be raised against the accused. In other words, it was the witnesses who actually would cast the first stones. So with that in mind, let's go back and hear Jesus' answer. You know what it was. Jesus just very calmly looked at everybody and he said, "Let anyone who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then Jesus just sort of drops the mic. He goes back to reading. There's no argument. Just that simple sentence. And it's a beautiful moment, because the answer is just so typically Jesus at work. Because there's layers to the answer. First, there's the obvious one, the one that we take away from it as followers of Christ. Don't be so eager to judge others, particularly in view of your own sins. It's so beautifully cast here that we can understand why so many people remember and like this story. People who aren't really familiar with the Bible have some recollection of hearing this story at some point. And that message of being slow to judge is one that's basically meant for everybody. But then there's also that canny, crafty country lawyer, that Matlock answer that he gives. And you have to understand the law to appreciate it. Remember, we speculated that the whole thing may have been a setup. The fact that there was no male in custody for this crime kind of smelled, actually. It looked shady. It looked like something you'd see in Washington, not in Jerusalem. With that in mind, we can see that by Jesus reminding his questioners that the law required that the witnesses to the crime had to be the ones to cast the first stones, Jesus was actually issuing a challenge. He was issuing a challenge to the ones who claimed to be witnesses, but somehow couldn't identify the man. He was issuing a challenge for these guys to step forward and lay claim to their morally ambiguous accusation there in public, in front of everybody. Maybe it's no surprise that these guys weighed their options, what it might do to their images, what it would look like. And they took a pass. They took a hard pass because every single one of them, witnesses, agitators, mob, they all disappeared. One by one. Leaving only Jesus and the woman who had been caught in adultery. This woman who had stared justice in the face, knowing that justice and death were just a stone's throw away, was now there alone. She was there standing before Jesus, not really understanding what had just happened. She was standing there with her terror now replaced by confusion. And maybe Jesus thought that was okay, because confusion comes before understanding. So Jesus just smiled at her. He told her, go on her way. You know what? Maybe stop sinning, okay? And I can imagine that he hoped at least that her close call might have impressed her enough to make her change her ways. As I said before, people love this story. It's got that comfortable element of Jesus outwitting his opponents that as Christians we like so much. It's got tension, it's got conflict, but above all, it's got hope. Hope that maybe the woman did turn her life around. Maybe she did turn from sin and embrace the grace, hope, and love that Jesus offered. Hope that when all looks lost, it's not. Hope that because of Jesus we can stand accused, we can stand guilty of sinning in thought, word, and deed, and still know that there is room for grace and repentance in life. Truth be told, I think people can see themselves in the stories, both accusers and accused. And they see that all is never lost. Now, the story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery is also a reminder to us 2,000 years later about the pitfalls of judging. Because who among us could rightly cast that first stone if the bar is set at being sinless? I can't. That's why, as you leave today, one of my able helpers back there is going to have a container has stones in it. And I'm going to invite you to take a stone and carry it with you this week. Put it in your pocket, put it in your purse. I know what you're thinking. Hey, I was just hoping to have something else to carry around. And maybe just for the week, carry it with you. And when you find yourself at least tempted to judge somebody, whether it's on social media, whether it's on the news, even if it's that person, that jerk that cuts you off on the highway and then takes off on the exit, reach in your pocket. Just feel that stone. And remember Jesus' words. That anyone among you who is without sin cast the first stone. And then if you take it out and whip it at somebody, I know we've got more work to do. But I'd like to think that we can all learn and have the strength not to cast the stone. That's what Jesus